From 1921 to 1932, Republicans controlled the House, the Senate, the White House, and more or less the federal courts. And they will embark on a program best summarized by Calvin Coolidge as the business of government is business. This is a super pro-business Republican regime. Harding, who's a nobody Ohio senator who was a compromise candidate himself, who had been elected to return us to normalcy after all the upset of the Progressive era in World War I, is essentially powerless, and his cabinet runs the presidency. He has an isolationist regime that simply ignores foreign affairs. He will say about himself, "I am a man of limited talents from a small town. I do not seem to grasp that I am president." And so what happens is party hacks, career politicians, will get those cabinet posts, and they will use them to line their own pockets. The Attorney General Daugherty and the Secretary of Interior Albert Fall will both become the centerpieces of massive scandals. In fact, the Harding administration is maybe the most scandal-ridden administration in American history. His cabinet will be called the Ohio Gang. They're mostly Ohio politicians. The most famous of these scandals is Teapot Dome, where Albert Fall, the Secretary of Interior, sells the oil reserves for the Navy. This is the oil we set aside so the Navy can have oil if we ever go to war. He sells that to two wealthy businessmen who give him $500,000. They don't give America $500,000. They give it to him, and he folds it up and puts it in his pocket. Daugherty, the Attorney General, had been publicly offering jobs for sale. He had a guy who worked with him, Jess Ferguson, who would just ask people, "Do you want a government job? Give me and my boss money, and we'll appoint you to whatever you want." By 1923, investigations are heavily underway into the corruption of the Harding administration. But Harding cleverly avoids being the first president ever removed from office by having two major heart attacks and dying. Now, if Harding would not have died in 1923, he almost certainly would have been the first president removed from office and might have been indicted. The garrulous, debaucherous, that means he parties a lot, Warren G. Harding is replaced by Calvin Coolidge, who's a dour, puritanical, uninteresting man. Remember, he had been the governor who had crushed the police strike in Boston. Despite having the opposite personality of Warren G. Harding, they actually have Coolidge and Harding have a lot in common. They're both very passive leaders, and they both essentially do whatever large businesses tell them to do. Coolidge, in fact, does very little. When Coolidge dies, Dorothy Parker quips, "How could they tell?" There's a great story Parker also tells of her and a friend being at a party, and Dorothy Parker betting her friend she couldn't get Coolidge to say 3 words. And her friend walks up and says, "My friend over there bet me that I couldn't get you to say 3 words." And Coolidge responds with "F you." And so Parker wins the bet. Coolidge crushes Davis in 1924. There, by the way, is Coolidge down there trying to get Southern votes as he runs against Al Smith, as the South is ready to vote for Republican because they ain't voting for a Catholic. Coolidge crushes Davis in 1924 and chooses, he's trying to get Southern votes against Jeff Davis. Coolidge doesn't run in 1928. He's done. He's had enough. And instead, he's going to turn the reins over to Herbert Hoover. The Republican Party and many Americans see the purpose of government to help big business, and then big business theoretically will help everybody else. This relationship had been forged in World War I between these two spheres, corporate America and the government. The Secretary of the Treasury, himself an incredibly wealthy industrialist and banker, Andrew Mellon, will get cuts in the corporate and income taxes as well as the inheritance tax. The idea if we cut their taxes, it'll provide a boom for the whole economy. Mellon and Hoover and Coolidge slash the federal budget, and they actually pay off half of the debt we incurred fighting World War I. The Secretary of Commerce is Herbert Hoover. He's the most active and visible member of the cabinet. He's a very appealing guy. He's very positive, very hopeful, very energetic, very bright. He's from Iowa. And his idea was volunteerism. He said the government should make suggestions, and then the corporations can decide to follow them or not. We don't need to regulate them. We just need to suggest that they do this or do that. And if they want to do it or not, that's up to them. This was volunteerism. Associationalism is the idea that industries should form associations and regulate themselves. Now, these regulations would be non-binding. The corporations could choose to ignore them if they wanted. But Hoover was a great believer that the corporations would, at the end of the day, do the right thing, that they wouldn't pursue their own narrow self-interest. They would do what was right for America. This doesn't work, as evidenced in the Great Depression and basically Hoover's entire presidency, but this is Hoover's belief. In 1928, because, as I said a minute ago, although I cited the wrong election, because the South isn't going to vote for a Catholic, Hoover smashes Al Smith. Hoover's administration never really gets anywhere because 11 months after he's inaugurated, 11 months after he's inaugurated, the entire world will come unglued as we have a global Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression, of course, will call the values, the ideals, the economic policies, and everything about the 1920s into question, as during the Great Depression, the 1920s were seen as the cause of the problem, not necessarily the good old days.